February 2025. A harbour on the industrial coast declared biologically dead by local environmental agencies. The water was near black, turbid, thick with decades of runoff. Dissolved oxygen had dropped below 2 milligrams per litre, the threshold beneath which most marine life simply cannot survive. No fish, no plankton, nothing visible living in that water at all. Then, on February 14th, 2025, X-Force arrived with barges loaded with 5 million live oysters and lowered them into the dark. 5 million sounds enormous. Against the scale of that harbour, it was a modest gesture. The team's own projections were cautious. Stabilise oxygen levels slightly, maybe nudge turbidity down over years of slow biological work. The oysters could die before they took hold. The water could overwhelm them. Dr. Lena Kowalski, lead marine ecologist on the project, gave it a measured chance. That's not what happened. Within 30 days, something in that harbour shifted in ways the data still can't fully explain. And the question that keeps coming back, the one this entire story turns on, is this. What happens to a dead ecosystem when you return the one creature it was always missing? I'm your host, and this is the full arc of one of the most improbable ecological recoveries documented in recent marine science. Not a simulation, not a controlled tank study, a real harbour written off, brought back from the edge, and the team behind it still arguing about what exactly they witnessed. X-Force is a marine restoration organisation working at the intersection of ecology and engineering. They don't just study broken ecosystems, they intervene in them, instrument them, and follow the data wherever it leads. This is episode 7 in a series documenting their real-world rewilding interventions, each one a live test of what nature can do when given the smallest foothold. The two people at the centre of this story are Dr. Lena Kowalski, the lead marine ecologist who designed the deployment, and Captain Victor Lang, the operations director who put 5 million living animals into water that had no business supporting them. Between the two of them, they've seen enough failed restoration attempts to be deeply sceptical of easy wins. What makes this harbour different isn't just the outcome. It's that the outcome forced everyone involved to reconsider something fundamental about how dead ecosystems work, and whether death, in ecological terms, is ever really final. We're going to follow this from the science of how a harbour dies, through the engineering of a single deployment day, all the way to what the monitoring data revealed in the weeks that followed. The stakes are larger than one harbour, because if what happened here can be replicated, the implications reach every dead waterway on the planet. Nobody was paying attention to the harbour back then. It looked like water, it smelled like water, and from a distance, on a grey winter morning, it even moved like water. That was about to change. The first thing you notice if you wade in close enough is the colour. Not the blue-grey of open ocean or the green shimmer of a healthy estuary. This water runs brown, sometimes copper, sometimes the colour of old tea left too long on a counter, and floating just beneath the surface in slow, drifting mats. A layer of algae so dense it blocks out the light like a curtain being drawn across a window. That algae is not an accident, it is a symptom. And to understand what it means, you have to understand a process called eutrophication, which is essentially the story of how a body of water eats itself to death. It starts with nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus mostly. In healthy amounts, they feed the base of the food web, the phytoplankton, the microscopic plant life that everything else depends on. But when those nutrients arrive in excess, the system tips. Algae blooms explode across the surface. They multiply faster than anything can eat them. And then, inevitably, they die. Here is where the real damage begins. When that algae dies and sinks, bacteria move in to decompose it. Decomposition is an oxygen-hungry process. The bacteria consume dissolved oxygen from the water column the way a fire consumes air in a sealed room. Oxygen levels drop. They drop below 5 milligrams per litre, which is already stressful for most marine life. They drop below 2 milligrams per litre, which is the threshold scientists call hypoxic, the point at which most fish, invertebrates and zooplankton simply cannot survive. In the worst cases, oxygen disappears almost entirely. That is the condition called anoxia. And a harbour in anoxia is not struggling. It is dying. By the late 1970s, dissolved oxygen readings in this harbour were already showing seasonal crashes. Summer was the worst. Warm water holds less oxygen than cold water, so every July and August the system was pushed right to the edge. Fish kills were reported. Shellfish beds went quiet. But the monitoring was inconsistent, the data scattered, and the regulatory appetite for confronting industrial polluters was, to put it generously, limited. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. The nutrient load driving all of this had two primary sources. The first was industrial discharge, decades of manufacturing runoff, chemical effluent, and the kind of casual dumping that predated modern environmental law, and then, in some cases, simply continued after it. The second was combined sewer overflows. This harbour, like hundreds of ageing urban waterways across the country, was served by a sewer system that combined stormwater and sewage in the same pipes. During heavy rain events, those pipes would overflow, releasing raw or partially treated sewage directly into the water. Not occasionally, regularly. By some estimates, tens of millions of gallons of overflow entered this harbour annually through the worst years of the 1980s and 1990s. But the nutrient problem was only half the story. The other half was turbidity. Suspended particles, sediment, algae fragments, organic matter filled the water column and blocked sunlight from reaching the bottom. Submerged aquatic vegetation, the grasses and weeds that root in shallow seafloor sediment and photosynthesize, began to disappear. And that mattered enormously because those plants were doing something critical. Through photosynthesis, they were producing oxygen. They were also stabilizing sediment, absorbing nutrients, and providing nursery habitat for juvenile fish. When the light disappeared, the plants disappeared. And when the plants disappeared, another oxygen source went with them. The clock was already ticking. The harbour just couldn't hear it yet. What makes this kind of collapse so insidious is the self-reinforcing nature of it. Remove the oxygen and you kill the organisms that would otherwise help stabilize the system. Remove the light and you kill the plants that would otherwise produce oxygen. And crucially, remove the filter feeders, the oysters, the mussels, the clams, and you remove the one biological mechanism capable of pulling suspended particles out of the water column fast enough to matter. By the late 20th century, this harbour's oyster population was effectively gone. Disease had swept through what overharvesting had left behind. Dermo, a parasitic infection caused by the protozoan Perkinsus murinus, had been advancing up the Atlantic coast for decades, and by the 1990s it had reached populations already weakened by pollution and habitat loss. The combination was lethal. Reefs that had once stretched across acres of shallow bottom were reduced to scattered shell fragments. The living animals were gone, and without them, nothing was left to arrest the cycle. The algae bloomed, the bacteria decomposed, the oxygen vanished, the turbidity climbed, the vegetation died, and the harbour, season by season, year by year, sank deeper into a condition that looked, to any honest observer, permanent. But the harbour wasn't done yet, not even close, because underneath all of that brown water, underneath the anoxic sediment and the ghost reefs of empty shell, something was being quietly studied. Scientists and restoration ecologists had been watching harbours like this one for years, building a body of evidence about what it would actually take to reverse a collapse this deep. And what they kept coming back to, again and again, was the same organism, the same animal that had been there before the industrial age, the same one that had been systematically removed. The harbour had roughly 2 decades of accumulated damage before the ecological debt became truly unpayable. And the clock had already started. Picture a single oyster. It is not beautiful, not in any conventional sense. The shell is rough and irregular, grey-white, shaped less like a jewel and more like a piece of discarded rubble. It sits on the seafloor or clings to a hard surface, and it does not move, it does not hunt, it does not chase. It simply opens and it waits. And while it waits, it works. Water enters through the oyster's mantle cavity, drawn across a set of gills lined with tiny hair-like structures called cilia. Those cilia beat in coordinated waves, creating a current that pulls water through at a rate that, in a healthy adult animal, can reach 50 gallons per day. 50 gallons. That is not a misprint. One oyster, one day, 50 gallons of water passing across its gills and being processed, sorted and filtered. Phytoplankton gets consumed. Suspended particles too fine for the eye to see get trapped in mucus, packaged into dense pellets called pseudofeces, and deposited on the seafloor. Nitrogen compounds, pathogens, even some heavy metals, all of them extracted from the water column and either metabolized or sequestered in the sediment below. What comes out the other side is cleaner, clearer, and measurably different from what went in. Now multiply that by 1,000, by 10,000, by 5 million. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. When researchers began modelling what a restored oyster population could theoretically do to a degraded harbour, the numbers they came back with were not incremental. They were transformational. A functioning oyster reef of meaningful scale could, under the right conditions, filter the entire water column of a small harbour in a matter of days, not weeks. Days. The turbidity that was blocking sunlight from reaching the bottom would begin to fall. And as the particles settled, as the water cleared, something extraordinary would follow. Light would reach the seafloor again. And where light reaches the seafloor of a shallow coastal system, submerged aquatic vegetation can return. Eelgrass, widgeon grass, the slow-growing meadows of underwater plants that had been absent for decades. Those plants would begin to photosynthesize. And photosynthesis, in a water column starved of oxygen, is not a minor contribution. It is a lifeline. By the early 2000s, restoration ecologists working in the Chesapeake Bay system had begun documenting exactly this sequence in pilot plots. Small-scale oyster reintroductions, carefully monitored, were producing measurable improvements in water clarity within months. By 2009, a landmark study in the journal Bioscience estimated that the Chesapeake's pre-colonial oyster population had been capable of filtering the entire volume of the bay in roughly 3 to 4 days. The modern population, by that point reduced to less than 1% of its historical abundance, required more than a year to do the same work. The difference between those two numbers is the difference between a functioning estuary and a dying one. But filtration was only part of the story, because an oyster reef is not just a water treatment system. It is a structure. The shells themselves, stacked and cemented together over years, create a 3-dimensional surface of extraordinary complexity. Crevices and overhangs, ridges and hollows, all of it colonized almost immediately by other invertebrates. Mussels attach to the outer surfaces. Polychaete worms thread through the gaps. Crabs shelter in the deeper recesses. Barnacles, amphipods, bryozoans, species after species arriving, finding purchase, building a community on what had previously been bare sediment or empty mud. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Not loudly enough, not early enough, not in a way that translated into policy before the reefs were gone. Because what those reefs supported, beyond the invertebrates, was fish, juvenile fish especially. Striped bass, flounder, tautog, species that depend on complex structural habitat during the early months of their lives. A reef provides cover from predators. It concentrates food. It gives a young fish something to orient to in an otherwise featureless bottom. Remove the reef, and you don't just lose the oysters. You lose the nursery. You lose the next generation of the fish that feed on the invertebrates that live on the reef. The whole web unravels from a single point. Ecologists have a term for this. They call it a keystone species, an organism whose influence on its environment is disproportionately large relative to its biomass. Remove a keystone and the arch collapses. The oyster in a coastal estuary is as close to a perfect keystone as the marine world produces. It filters the water, it clears the light, it oxygenates the bottom, it builds the reef, it attracts the fish. It does all of this simultaneously, passively, continuously, for as long as it lives. Everything was in place. The science just didn't know yet what everything was building toward in this particular harbour, with this particular scale of intervention. Some of the researchers who had been publishing on oyster restoration since the 1990s had seen the trajectory of this harbour and drawn their own conclusions. One of them, working out of a coastal ecology program on the eastern seaboard, had written plainly in a 2018 paper that the harbour represented a textbook case of filter feeder collapse, and that restoration at scale was not only feasible, but arguably the only mechanism capable of reversing the anoxia cycle without decades of infrastructure investment. Nobody listened. The paper was cited 11 times in 3 years. 11 times. For a finding that described a potential solution to one of the most documented environmental failures on the regional coastline. Nobody listened. But the version you've heard? That's not the full picture. Because while Dr. Kowalski's models were sitting largely unread in academic databases, a small environmental engineering firm called X-Force was doing something unusual. They were actually reading them. By early 2025, X-Force had been operating in coastal restoration for nearly a decade, and their Phase 7 report, finalised in March of that year, represented something genuinely different from anything the harbour had seen before. Not a clean-up proposal, not a dredging plan. A living systems intervention built around the oyster and scaled to a number that still stops people mid-sentence when they hear it. 5 million organisms. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry. But before a single oyster touched the water, the team spent months doing something that doesn't make for dramatic footage. They mapped the floor. Using bathymetric survey equipment, sonar systems that build three-dimensional pictures of underwater terrain, X-Force's site assessment team charted every contour of the harbour bottom, every silty depression, every ridge where sediment had accumulated over decades of neglect. What they found confirmed what the historical record had long suggested. In several zones, the substrate was almost identical to the conditions that had once supported thriving oyster reefs before the industrial era. Silty, soft, and nutrient-dense in the worst possible way, choked with organic matter that had been decomposing without oxygen for years. Exactly the kind of environment where a filter feeding engineer could begin to make a difference if it survived long enough to try. That last part was the problem. The oysters sourced for the project came from certified hatcheries, selected specifically for disease resistance. They arrived as juvenile spat-on shell, microscopic larvae that had already settled and begun calcifying onto fragments of oyster shell substrate, giving them a physical anchor and a head start on survival. These weren't wild-caught animals pulled from a healthy reef. They were purpose-bred for a compromised environment, chosen because their genetic lines had shown resilience in low oxygen, high turbidity conditions. Even so, the water they were being asked to enter was, by any reasonable measure, hostile. Captain Victor Lang, who would later oversee the physical deployment, was brought into the planning process early. His concern wasn't logistical in the conventional sense. It wasn't about crane capacity or barge scheduling, though those mattered too. His concern was biological. Lower 5 million juvenile oysters into the harbour in a single mass deployment, and you don't save them, you kill them. Not through the water quality alone, but through themselves. Oysters respire. They consume dissolved oxygen as they filter. Concentrate too many of them in one zone, and they'll strip the already depleted water of whatever oxygen remains, suffocating themselves and everything nearby before they've had a chance to begin their work. The solution was staging. The deployment was designed in phases, spread across mapped zones of the harbour floor, with each release calculated to stay within the oxygen budget of its target area. Zone by zone, week by week, from April through July 2025, the 5 million organisms would be introduced gradually, allowing each cohort to establish, begin filtering, and fractionally improve local conditions before the next wave arrived. It was, in essence, a carefully choreographed ecological handoff, each generation of oysters preparing slightly better water for the ones that followed. Dr. Kowalski's models, finally being applied rather than cited, projected a 30 to 40% reduction in turbidity over 12 to 18 months as the conservative baseline. That number is worth sitting with. Not a complete reversal. Not a restored harbour by any dramatic definition. A 30 to 40% reduction in the suspended particles clouding the water, enough, if it held, to begin allowing light to penetrate to the sediment layer. Enough to begin the chain of consequences that Kowalski had described in that underread paper. Light reaching the bottom, submerged aquatic vegetation establishing, dissolved oxygen climbing, the anoxia cycle losing its grip. 30 to 40%. Conservative, 12 to 18 months. And the timing of what happened next? Almost too perfect. Because alongside those projections sat a section of the Phase 7 report that received considerably less attention in the press coverage that would eventually follow. The Risk Register. 3 pages of acknowledged uncertainties, written in the careful language of people who have seen restoration projects fail before and refuse to pretend otherwise. Predation by invasive species, particularly the aggressive mud crab populations that had colonized the harbour floor during the anoxic years, thriving in conditions that had killed off their competitors. Low oxygen stress on the juvenile oysters during the critical establishment window, before their filtration activity could begin to shift local conditions. And the one that sat heaviest in the room during planning meetings, the potential for disease outbreak in a compromised water body. A harbour that had been oxygen depleted for years was not a sterile environment. It was a microbially dense one, full of anaerobic bacteria that had been thriving in the absence of oxygen for decades. Introducing 5 million juvenile organisms, animals with immune systems calibrated for difficult conditions, but not for this specific cocktail of pathogens, carried real risk. The hatchery sourcing and the disease-resistant selection were designed to mitigate that risk. They were not designed to eliminate it. The team knew this. They deployed anyway, because the alternative was documented. The harbour's trajectory without intervention had been measured, modelled, and confirmed. The risk of acting was real. The certainty of not acting was worse. One detail from the substrate mapping, a single anomalous silty depression in the harbour's northeastern quadrant, flagged in the bathymetric data as unusually deep and unusually still, would come back to haunt the deployment team. But that's getting ahead of the story. April in the harbour looked almost exactly like it had in the cold open. The same flat, dark water. The same absence of birds. The same smell, sulphurous and low. The kind of smell that registers before you consciously identify it, the way a room tells you something is wrong before you see what it is. The barges arrived loaded with mesh bags, each one packed with oyster spat on shell, each one representing a fraction of the 5 million organisms that would be introduced in phases through July. The dissolved oxygen readings that morning sat at 1.8 milligrams per litre, near zero visibility. The sediment below, disturbed by the survey equipment in prior weeks, had released fresh plumes of anaerobic material that turned the water the colour of weak coffee. Captain Lang described it plainly, the way people do when they've decided not to dress something up. You're lowering living animals into what looks like motor oil and hoping they hold on. That's what the deployment was. Not a ribbon cutting, not a triumph. A wager placed carefully in stages by people who had done the math and decided the odds were worth taking. As each mesh bag descended, monitoring buoys were anchored alongside, real-time sensors broadcasting dissolved oxygen levels, turbidity readings and pH data back to the X-Force Operations Centre. The harbour floor was now instrumented. Whatever happened next would be recorded. The first bags settled into the silt. The water closed over them. And the harbour, which had been silent for years, was asked to hold something alive again. We didn't restore the harbour. We returned the animal that knew how, and then got out of its way. The harbour was silent for years, except now the instruments won't stop talking. Subscribe to catch the next comeback story before it happens.